Okay, so I think we're almost ready. So just like to welcome people in. Um, my name is Mark Phillips. I'm CEO here at SafeCipher, and very happy today to have Dwayne Gefferie joining us over from Amsterdam. And then also here in the room we have Mark Beresford from Edgar Dunn as well, and my colleague Jeff Slawsky as well. So today is the first fraud forum, as we're calling it, that we've been kicking off. This is something which we want to become a regular webinar where we can bring in experts from across the industries, across different parts of geography as well, to come and really talk to us and actually discuss freely and openly about actually what's really going on in fraud. And this is part of a larger series which we're looking at, which is some of this is going to be in person, but we're also conscious that thanks to some tube strikes and public transport strikes in London, in person was going to be quite difficult today. So we've launched this as a webinar, but we're going to keep on both formats going. So it's, we evolve as times move, and happy to be here with everyone today. So I'd just like to start by introducing my colleague Jeff, who is one of the most experienced and most interesting and charming people I know in payments. He's been in the payments industry, I think, for 40 odd years now, Jeff.
That's true.
And has really been there, seen there, and done that, more to the point, across a number of really interesting innovations and big changes. And I think that's where we are today, is we're at a moment where fraud is changing, the payments industry is changing, but there's a lot we can learn from the past, and there's a lot we can understand from what's going on if we're going to really be able to understand what's coming in the future and how do we address that. So, Jeff, over to you, and maybe you'd like to introduce Mark.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. We appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to join the conversation. Mark is right. I've been in the payments industry for over 45 years. If there's one thing I can attest to, it is that it is always changing. I started back in the day with, triplicate receipts and paper being deposited at the bank at night. There was no digital whatsoever, no terminals. And in my 45 plus years, it has transformed tremendously. And it will continue to transform. The only thing that is changing is the pace of that transformation. And that's really what we want to get at today. We want to start with an overview of sort of the things that are happening to set the view of some of the issues that we face as an industry, and then open up the second part of this to really delving into a discussion around how to deal with those. So to set that overview, we've invited Mark Beresford from Edgar Dunn and Company, another longtime participant in the payments industry. And we're going to give you a quick overview, relatively quick overview of what's happening globally, both in terms of e-commerce and the coming transition to agentic commerce. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and really delighted to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. So, as you said, let's make sure we can progress the slides. As you say, my name is Mark Beresford. I'm a director at Edgar Dunn and Company, based in London. We're a global financial services and advisory company. We have 6 offices around the world. I head up retail and hospitality payments practice. And you say, Jeff, you've been in the business for over 40 years. You can probably remember zip-zap machines.
Do.
And so do I. So, so showing our age. There's three topics I want to cover: market perspectives, the importance of e-commerce in a bigger, wider ecosystem of shopping, retail payments, and the implications of e-commerce or agentic commerce. And we'll spend a little bit of time on that. So first of all, just set the scene. There's no doubt when we look at card payments, it's still representing an enormous portion of total payments. Shopping is no longer a destination. It's not a place where you go, but it's actually an ecosystem which closely relates to what's happening online. So a lot of retailers, a lot of businesses talk about omni-channel, click and collect, returns, unified customer journeys. I think we've worked with this industry for quite a few years. We've found 30 different omni-channel customer journeys, whether it's reserve and pick up or return to store, trial and buy later. All sorts of those journeys are blurring the lines between what's online and what's offline. It truly is a digitization of every customer journey at every touch point across the ecosystem. I think if I ask the audience or anyone here in the room, when was the last time you used cash? I think personally, it was at the barbers for some reason, my Turkish barbers, and then also my dry cleaners. So that's obviously a case of money laundering. So, sorry, it had to be said.
Didn't know that was coming.
Yeah, so in terms of e-com online, it's certainly greater than 30% in terms of value. This is obviously transactions, large ticket values, valued like airline tickets and hotel bookings are going to represent an enormous portion. And as you can see, North America is very card-centric type of organization, country, I should say. The mature and developing markets, or the emerging markets like Asia Pacific, LATAM, are playing a little bit of a catch-up time at this point in terms of e-commerce. E-commerce, again, in terms of growth, we've seen terrific growth around the globe, but the more mature markets such as North America and Europe seen a strong growth initially at 2020 to 2025, but 25 to 30 is a little bit of slowing down. I think it's interesting if you look at Africa, e-wallets and e-money, mobile wallets really are sort of paying a big attention there in terms of e-commerce, but e-commerce has got a long way to go in that emerging markets. The ones to watch is really LATAM and Asia Pacific in terms of e-commerce. If we look at fraud-related pressures, some of the biggest challenges in e-commerce is card not present fraud. It remains to be a big challenge. It's still growing. It's still growing almost as fast as payments are actually growing in certain markets. The success story, I guess, maybe a little bit biased towards Europe because of strong customer authentication being mandated within the region through a European initiative of the Payment Services Directive. I think what remains critical threat to card not present transactions is the projections are still growing. It's still expected to exceed billions and billions of dollars over the next 4 to 5 years. And I think that's still representing a challenge in terms of card payments. I've mentioned already the European directive. I think Europe was experiencing just on its own in 2024 over 4 billion worth of fraud losses. I think strong customer authentication is striking that balance between creating security and also allowing for a good customer experience. I think most customers within Europe are comfortable with strong customer authentication. There are exceptions within the ecosystem that allows for whitelisting or trusted beneficiaries, exceptions for low value transactions, ticketing barriers such as on transport systems. It has significantly impacted fraud in a positive way. And I think in the first year of implementing fraud values came down at least 50%. So as we've seen in the previous statistics, I think growth of fraud is, particularly around cards, is still a challenge, and it's still growing around about 3%. In some markets, actually more than actual card growth in general. I think the consumers are presented with not just cards, with a significant amount of alternative forms of payment.
On this slide, this one caught my interest when you first shared, how we're going to approach this. What do you think the implication is, given consumers, especially younger consumers, access the payment system in so many different ways now through so many third parties? What are the implications for security of an end-to-end transaction and who bears the liability and those kinds of things?
I think, Jeff, you've asked a good question. With alternative forms of payment, it's really representing, particularly on e-commerce, over 50%, maybe 60% in certain markets. And I think that's just presenting more options for the fraudster to present and create new attack vectors. I think that's the biggest challenge around alternative forms of payment. I think, with open banking, particularly in Europe, with the Payment Services Directive, there are some initiatives around strong customer authentication and, whether it's biometrics, but there's a lot of markets with a lot of alternative forms of payment that is presenting a real challenge.
Yeah, and obviously with all those different entry points, that, as you said, leads to new attacks, new types of attacks, and the things we've built up for what we know previously don't necessarily apply as we go forward.
Precisely. So accepting payments online, it just presents a multitude of issues and challenges. It's very complicated and it's challenging. I won't go through all these, but I think it is a stepping stone into agentic commerce, which is the next wave of challenges that we are anticipating. Let's just pause for a bit in terms of agentic commerce, where we are today. We are in a period of experimentation, lots of proof of concept and piloting. We're going from chatbots or shopping assistants to more sophisticated augmented grocery assistance type of scenarios. So anything is possible, and we're seeing a lot of examples of this within the market. And just 3 examples in terms of travel, general shopping, and grocery. And I think the grocery is a very, very, very interesting area, which we're anticipating to be a preferred way of looking at commoditized goods that can be very, very quickly purchased and transacted. I think it might be, just take a step back, it might be worth just mentioning there are sort of different models that are emerging within agentic commerce. And I don't tend to like these terms, but they are generally gaining traction. B2A or B2A, or business to agent, an agent to consumer, and an agent to agent. I think what's fair to say, all the tech providers, whether it's Perplexity, Claude from Anthropic, ChatGPT from OpenAI, Gemini from Google, etc., they're all trying to play a role within this ecosystem. I think the terms, as I say, I don't necessarily like them, but on the left-hand side, it's really a merchant or consumer agent approaching the merchant. So a consumer agent would be using something like OpenAI or Gemini to generate the inquiry and then potentially the sale. Whereas the agent to consumer, the middle example, is where the merchant has created its own agent to deal with the consumer. So the best example, the one that's probably been around for several years, is Amazon Rufus, which, if you've ever tried it, if you bought a new camera, you're looking for a camera bag, then Rufus can provide you some advice about which bags will be right for that
exact
camera.
match, if you will.
Exactly. Whereas I think the next wave of Rufus, and along with other merchant agents, will become a lot more sophisticated in the future. Those first 2 models are the ones that we're expecting to see to gain traction, and that we're already seeing those examples. Agent to agent is probably not quite there yet. That's where it's fully autonomous, where the consumer's agent is interacting with the merchant's agent independently. So there's no doubt agentic or agentic commerce, I should say, is going to gain traction. Some of our projections is within the next to become mass market. The definition of mass market is debatable, but when it's 30% take up of executing transactions through agentic commerce is expected within the next 5 to 10 years, which is very, very different to, say, smartphone penetration globally, contactless versus face-to-face transactions, e-commerce versus retail. So that whereas some of those technologies have taken a lot longer to gain traction. There's no doubt agentic is taking a lot of.
And I think this slide just reinforces the point we talked about at the beginning. It's not that change hasn't been a part of our industry forever. It's the pace of change. The adoption rate is so much faster. People are more comfortable, and it happens quicker, which means as participants in the industry, we have to respond quicker. We don't have the luxury of waiting to see how it plays out.
Exactly. And some merchants ask us, are agentic commerce transactions happening today? The answer is yes. They were happening last year. I think we were first starting to see them, and it's gaining traction. I think when we measure the growth, it's not necessarily going to create new growth. It's more of a cannibalization of what's happening out there. This slide just summarizes what the next slide is really saying. I think what's important in North America and Asia Pacific is really the early adopters. I think Europe is not quite there, and they have to overcome some of the strong customer authentication challenges. But in terms of a proportion of e-commerce is growing about 8% year on year over the next 4 or 5 years. I think agentic is got something like 185% growth. So it's significant. And likewise around the different regions in North America, APAC, and LATAM, etc. So in terms of verticals, I think it's safe to say that we've already seen examples where people are, making travel arrangements, using AI to make inquiries about, their flights, their connections. I think the next generation of flight planning and travel planning will, make it more smoother, make it more agentic-like. At the moment, it's still the wave one is that the wave one agentic commerce is really the human's still in the loop. They're making the final purchase. They're maybe being presented with options, and they'll make that transaction. But food delivery, groceries, marketplaces, and general retail, travel and mobility are certainly, areas that we think are more likely to be turning to agentic models, and consumers are more likely to be more responsive and adaptive in those sectors.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think the two drivers of adoption will be the size of the transaction and the complexity of the transaction.
Yeah.
Ordering your dinner through DoorDash is one thing. Planning a trip to Italy next year is quite another.
Exactly. And I think in terms of what's making the merchants a little bit nervous at the moment is agentic commerce. I think last year was the year of the announcement. I think there were 8 different major announcements around agentic from all the various players, whether it's MasterCard, Visa, OpenAI, Google. Those announcements, probably around about eight announcements in the year. They're still the dust is still settling. I think there's 3 areas of the protocols that are existing around commercial commerce protocols, payment protocols, and merchant APIs. And I think that there's more to come. I think trusted agent protocols from Visa, new distribution capacity from the IATA, from the airlines. I think all these different protocols are having to arguably orchestrate between them. I think that's what is going to be an interesting development, and how merchants are going to deal with all those.
For sure.
I think agentic presents 4 new fraudster or fraud challenges around fake merchant storefronts, unauthorized distributed purchases. I think T's and C's, agents mistreating customers or not being updated around the terms and conditions of the consumer purchase, and the growing bot-driven fraud pressure that is existing around. If it's good for the consumer, it's good for the fraudsters. And I think the fraudsters will be turning to AI to find that as a new route to market for themselves. So therefore, I think what the industry needs to do is really sort of develop a liability framework around identification, verification, and validation. I think that framework is still evolving. I think the difference between the good bots and the bad bots, and the good humans and the bad humans, are still being worked out. The industry is responding and developing protocols and frameworks around this, and the impact on, chargebacks, liability, etc., is still evolving, and it's one that's worth keeping a close eye on. This probably is a little bit complicated here, but the expectation, I think I mentioned it earlier, the expectations, the current situation and the future state. I think that we're in a transition period where, who is acting the legal entity or acting, if I instruct my agent to go and buy my groceries for the week, how do I know whether it's going to buy the ones that I want? I might say I want baked beans, but do I want Heinz baked beans? The brand equity is going to be kind of an interesting area. I think human in the loop is still going to be the case for the next few years. And so, go on, you.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're getting at an issue that is key to what happens at agentic and the rate of growth of agentic, which is certainly, I think humans would like to stay in a loop for a while till they get comfortable. Certainly, I think the human's card issuer, their bank, or wherever they get their credit card from, would like that. I believe merchants, on the other hand, would like to do it as automated and quickly as possible. So there might be some inherent friction between some of the parties in the system.
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. And I think there's going to be some pilots around that.
Oh, we have a question. I'm sorry.
Where did we go? Have we got?
Yeah. So a question there, which is, is there any difference in the adoption timeline depending on the geographies?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, for some reason we couldn't see the question, but no problem. I think North America is sort of a lot more experimental. They are, adopting agentic commerce more quickly than Europe. I think Europe is still a few years behind. I mean, maybe I could just highlight this slide. We set up a task force within Egadun last almost 12 months ago. We've done quite a few interviews with merchants and different operators within the ecosystem, and we're finding some, with agentic commerce, some strengths and some weaknesses, as you'd expect. Some of the strengths around customer adoption is no doubt, cost control, expectation, operational efficiency. I think from a merchant perspective, all those are good things. But on the other hand, there's some challenges around. I mentioned that the Heinz baked beans, brand equity or brand dilution is a challenge. What does it mean? If I'm looking for a particular, I'm just looking for toilet paper. What does that mean for Unilever or Procter and Gamble? Discoverability risk, the possibility that actually some products might actually not be discoverable by some of these agents because the merchant simply does not have the right MCP server or the ability to list and categorize products properly. So, and trust and transparency is a big priority, which is still to be dealt with. So let me just finalize on this last slide. And I think what, for a number of workshops we've had with merchants, it's really around 3 steps. The agentic strategy needs to be, right for the business. You need to look at what's right for you. Some of the smaller merchants are a little bit more experimental. Some of the larger merchants are, wait and watch and see and cautious. It obviously depends on the vertical you're in. I think if you're an OTA, like an online travel agent, I think they are, very, very actively pursuing agentic from a merchant's perspective because they don't want to be disintermediated, as you'd expect. The second item is around creating the ability to create audit trails to make it clear who the consumer and who has actually made the instruction to the agent to make the purchase. And then thirdly is around fraud frameworks, reducing risk around misalignment and the chargeback situation. That needs to be really closely looked at in terms of prioritizing the activities from a merchant perspective. So I think that hopefully that was within reasonable time.
Absolutely.
I'll leave it up to in terms of questions and answers.
So any further questions on the overview before we transition a little bit and open up to some more broad-based questions? Mark, let's send it back to you.
That's great. That was super interesting, guys. And I think, Mark, there's a huge amount there to unpack. And I think when it comes to some of that as well, as we actually start to get into the conversation here with Dwayne. So I'd just like to introduce Dwayne now. And Dwayne is someone who we've known of for a long time. We've got to know recently. Very privileged and happy to have met him. And I think he's one of those sort of, I would consider to be the sort of sharpest strategic voices in payments. And so his background is actually spent 2 decades inside the companies as an operator, building out the modern payment stack. So think people like Checkout.com, Verifone. He's advising people like MasterCard, Barclays, WorldPay across fraud and payment strategy. Today, I think what most of you probably know him through is actually through the Payment Strategy Breakdown, which is his sort of newsletter. It's essential reading. If you haven't read it, I would definitely recommend you to go and do that. Have a look at I think it's Gefferie.com, where he's talking there about authorization rates, talking about fraud economics. There's been a really good series where he's been diving into all different aspects of the industry as well. And the last piece actually most recently was just on the false decline tax, and actually how much of a problem that really actually is. So Dwayne's been a really useful voice for us and a thought partner with us as well as we've been building out SafeCipher. But I think today is really about actually thinking about where fraud is really being won and lost. So Dwayne, welcome to the forum. Really privileged and very, very pleased to have you on. And love to maybe give us some insight into what you're seeing at the moment in the market and where are you finding the interesting bits of insight that's happening now?
Thank you very much, Mark. I think for me, what I'm currently seeing is a couple of different things, right? My biggest thesis in all of it is what I call the encroaching technologies on our space. I've been in payments for over 23 years. I've worked on issuing, I've worked on acquiring, I've worked with fraud providers, I've built fraud engines myself. I was a data scientist at Adyen in their early days where they became an acquirer as well. So what I keep on seeing every single time is how other technology providers, and it's not something against them, but how other technology providers are always coming into the payment space. And I'm very protective of the payment space because I believe that we have some of the brightest people who've come from different walks of life and are coming in and actually helping us to, one, that transition from cash to cards that Mark already had in his slide deck. And now we're going to that actually a third iteration, right? We've gone from cash to card, from cards to online, and now online to agentic. But what I continue to see now is how other parties are coming in and actually influencing the way that we're doing payments by encroaching technology. AI is one of those bigger things, but also we have fraud, we have machine learning, payments optimization. All of those things are actually coming from other parties who are now having an influence on that. And I think the interesting thing that I'm seeing for the first time actually is we're not just sitting back and waiting for it to happen. I think the Apple Pay conversation was a great one, right? It wasn't bad or anything, but it was Apple introducing something. Google, of course, had their own as well, but they came in on a slightly different perspective where they really took a lot of the technologies to themselves. They didn't open it up. Now we're seeing some of the lawsuits allowing them to, or actually forcing them to open that up. But now for the first time, we're seeing payments companies from issuers, acquirers, PSPs actually saying, look, the technology is great, but we're not going to have somebody else write our story for us. And I think we see that first and foremost in the agentic protocols. We see the likes of Google, but also now Stripe and other ones introducing them. And instead of sitting back and actually saying, let this happen to us, A lot of the payments companies are saying, no, we want to be part of that conversation. What are those protocols? How can we influence that? Have you thought about X, Y, and Z? And I think the biggest example in all of that is how OpenAI came out and actually was dictating in a little bit on what they wanted agentic commerce to look like and how that would be, how the value within all of that would be captured. And when they came to the realization that payments is actually a lot more challenging than they anticipated on, mostly because they thought they could just come in and provide their technology and take over a lot of that value. They've seen that everything from taxes, from onboarding to dealing with fraud prevention as well is highly complex. And we've been building that for the last 20, 30, 40 years actually in doing that. So I think the first time what I'm really seeing is that we as a payments industry are standing up, are saying we're going to be the ones being part of that conversation. We're going to innovate ourselves. We're introducing our own protocols. We're working together cross collaboratively as well. And I think that's for me is one of the biggest things that I'm seeing right now. It's that it's not about one versus the other. It's about the collective. It's about creating a new standards as we've done with EMV, as we've done with 3DF. Now we're creating our own standards. And that's something I truly enjoy seeing and having a lot of great conversations with payment service providers, but also with merchants on how we're stepping it up and actually embracing a lot of this technologies being encroaching on our space, but actually making it our own and actually evolving from that.
That's critical. And by the way, the piece about it suddenly being actually the payments industry having to step up really resonates. And I'm based in the West Coast. I've been in San Francisco for 15 years, and I look at it and actually I was at an agentic conference a few weeks ago, and it was interesting there where it was everyone's obsessed by the technology and how we can build this beautiful, amazing technology, and was just sort of it was almost as if it was operating in a completely different sphere. It wasn't really acknowledging actually that what we've got already is frankly quite amazing, and the fact that you look at the credit card system now. It works. It's brilliant. Now, sure, other things that can be optimized and improved, absolutely. But I think there's the bit I sort of like really open this up to the group actually in some ways too. But I think particularly for you, Dwayne, let's start with that. Is when you actually look at it though, there's a lot of talk always in this, and I think particularly the last few years, and it's understandable. There's a lot of unknowns of where we are really at the moment. But what's the real change you actually see happening this year? Now, what's the doing bit? Versus I think where we're still just talking about it. And the reference for me on this one is obviously going to be around agentic. I think it's interesting how that's got to such a crazy big scale already. I heard a stat that was 34% of shopping at Black Friday last year was agentic based. It didn't necessarily have the checkout, but it was definitely agentic driving that through. It feels in some ways maybe that's going to be the answer, but there was also lots of people still looking but not doing. What are you seeing which people are actually doing this year, and where do you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So even though we don't see the volumes yet of agentic commerce end to end, right? And I think there've been a number of questionnaires and a number of reports as well that came out. It says, look, when you look at Europe, when you look at the US, the trust with consumers might not necessarily be there on the just take my credit card and go shopping for me. But the discovery aspect, that's the big thing that's really changing right now. And that's where you see a lot of the payments companies actually saying, okay, we have to be a part of that conversation because something's fundamentally changing with that. Let me explain that a little bit. So I've looked at this a little bit further and I said, okay, what is actually being disrupted at the moment is not so much the payment stack or the payments infrastructure. It's actually the way that transactions are occurring, right? Meaning that that discovery aspect that used to be we as humans, right? We as humans would go on a browser, we would go search, we would do the discovery ourselves, we would compare different sites, we would have maybe different tools that we could use for that comparison. But that discovery aspect, which is traditionally search, Google search and search engines that are getting us into that flow. Then you have the affiliate links, you have the banner ads, and you have all of those other elements that come into that. That's about $500 billion in ad spend or spend that merchants were spending on all of that. With agentic, what we're now seeing is that all of that is most likely going to replace by an agent that doesn't require any of that, right? It's a technology that is querying an API and does different things to actually get to that discovery of that product. So I'm saying like we at payment, we're being relied upon while the other aspect, the discovery aspect is actually changing within that. And I think that's the biggest fundamental shift that we're seeing. And we as payments companies are now anticipating saying, hey, wait a second, it's not so much about what's changing for us, but it's actually how that value or how we've anticipated how a transaction would come to us that's now changing. So we have to change for the future that is already coming towards. And I think that's where I see a lot of payments companies actually adjusting for. So then they start looking at the protocols. I think know your agent is one of those crucial things that all of those companies are really looking at. Visa introduced the Trusted Agent Protocol. MasterCard introduced Agent Pay. So the decision then becomes, do you start integrating with all of them, or do you start leveraging one over the other, or do you start working with UP2, AP2 from Google or UPC? And what I'm seeing is that payments companies are basically coming down to three things. It's either they want to be a part of the conversation and they need to implement everything and be a part of that conversation and building that into their infrastructure, allowing merchants to then seamlessly be able to also accept agentic transactions. So they're doing a lot more on that. They're either orchestrating it. So the orchestration with agentic protocols will definitely be a class, right? You'll either have separate providers who are going to be integrating all those protocols to enable payment service providers and acquirers to actually process those transactions on behalf of merchants. Or you're still seeing some of the payment service providers and acquirers sitting back and actually saying, we want to see where this plays out, if the volume actually is going to be there. So we're going to take it a little bit slow. We're not going to spend the money. We're not going to invest in it. We'll have somebody look at it, but we'll take a little bit of our time. But I think those are the fundamental things that I'm seeing, and sort of like the strategies that are being deployed with payment service providers and acquirers at the moment.
I think all that resonates. I'm just thinking, like, Mark, you're getting really interesting insight. You're getting really interesting insight in terms of actually also what you're seeing people actually doing and on the ground and the questions they're asking on this piece around where people are actually, what are people actually doing versus actually what are they talking about? What sort of stuff are you seeing in that space too?
From a merchant perspective, is that okay?
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah. So from a merchant perspective, I think I think I said earlier, it depends on the vertical. I think travel agents, online travel agents, are very very cognizant of that. Agents from outside the ecosystem could be scraping their inventory, their hotels, their flights, etc., and transacting with consumers outside their ecosystem. So the likes of Expedia, Last Minute, Yahoo, so all those travel platforms are wanting to, Booking.com, wanting to generate their own agents to act on behalf of their customers. They want to own the customer. They want to advise and help them plan their holidays in the future. And agentic is certainly the way it's going to go. That's not to say the other mechanism won't exist. I think you have to play a little bit of a schizophrenic role that some consumers will adopt OpenAI or Gemini or Claude and plan their holidays that way, and then be presented with options. Whether they end up booking it on booking.com or lastminute.com, it is debatable. It's yet to be seen. That's the travel sector. In I think airlines, they're not quite there from what we've seen. They are, got some other challenges around payment acceptance and e-commerce and new distribution channels. I think they haven't quite got there. Maybe a very, very few examples that are being piloted by certain innovative airlines. General retail, I think it's open season. It's grocery we've seen, and we've had a few workshops with different big retailers, big brand retailers. It's interesting, Dwayne touched on that. An agent doesn't care about the brand. Back to the Heinz beans. A can of beans is a can of beans. It doesn't matter whether it's Heinz beans or the own brand brand. I think brand and discoverability is going to be real challenge for a lot of these retailers.
I mean, I think to that point, I think there's actually an interesting question in the chat as well, which is also about. I mean, I think one of the great things I always saw was the potential of agentic was that, for all of us, I think the example you were giving earlier on travel and things, and Dwayne was referring to, is that we would go off and we were going like, we're trying to book a flight and we'd have like maybe 10 tabs open. And you're going through that whole crazy process of trying to coordinate my hotel and my flight and rental car and all the rest of it. But we've got a very limited scope of what we can look at. I think one of the things I always thought was really compelling about agentic is the agent can look at 100 pages or 1,000 pages. It doesn't really matter. There's an incredible universal potential from agentic. Now, all the people both of you have mentioned, though, are all the big players. So does this feel like we're actually moving here to a two-tier system where, the big guys can afford to invest the money, can afford to keep up to date with MCP, UCPs, all the rest of it, and the networks, what they're doing. How do the smaller players compete, and how do we make sure that in an economy and world that's going to get very disrupted by agentic and is going to, sadly, it seems to be a bunch of losers as well as winners, what can we do to actually help some of the smaller players actually embrace this world so we don't end up with this sort of two-speed system?
Yeah, I think it's almost like the haves and the have-nots. The smaller merchants and the small to medium businesses are going to rely on their payment partners. The bigger merchants, the Walmarts, the Amazons, are going to generate and create their own strategies, as to be expected. We've seen already Walmart developing products that are not just about their customers, but also their back office, their logistics, inventory control, partners, partner management, using AI to more, introduce efficiencies in that back office. So I think that's inevitable. There's probably going to be a mid market which are going to have to, determine whether they are working with their payment service providers, whether it's Stripe or Adyen or WorldPay or whatever, there'll be a number of merchants that are just going to be wait and see what's happened. What's the adoption from consumer point of view?
I think that consumer point of view is going to be a really interesting pivot point, actually, that whole consumer choice. And Jeff, you always talk about this, the consumer is the center of this thing. And just before this started, we were having the debate and I was sort of going like, well, actually, I think, isn't there a slightly existential threat at the moment that what's traditionally been the issuers in this space who have been holding that relationship, and we've all got a banking app on our phone somewhere, which we deal with, interact with, that's being slightly disintermediated. I mean, Dwayne, to your point, the tech companies at the moment, and what I look at something like Apple Pay, it's starting to own a relationship with the customer, the end consumer. And suddenly it's not hard to imagine a world where actually the issuers and the processors and the rest of it can start to be very disintermediated from actually what's going on with the end consumer. Are you seeing any of that? And how do you think that the networks in particular are really thinking about that? What's the approach of how do we keep the customer at the center, but make sure that doesn't kill the whole current ecosystem?
Well, I think across the board, we're seeing everybody playing or playing out their own playbook, and it's becoming more and more evident. I think Apple is a great example, right? So what have we seen just in the last couple of days? Well, besides their CEO resigning and somebody else coming to take in their place, I think Apple has been very adamant on the fact that they're a hardware player, right? They do have an iOS, they have a whole ecosystem, and Apple Pay is definitely just one of those components in there. I think if you go a layer deeper, where Apple really made their innovation, really changed the game, was actually the tokenization of cards. So the tokenization of cards was actually what they truly created something that was much more secure than everything that was out there. And they've really been able to leverage that and grow Apple Pay over time. I think what we're seeing now is the networks and everybody else understanding the value of that. So I think in the last couple of years, we see network tokens, right? It started out with PSP tokens and then acquired tokens, and now we've gone to network tokens. I believe that network tokens will be a crucial element in the whole agentic process and agentic commerce, and that's where we're learning on. So when I look at that, I actually think that the schemes, the networks, the MasterCards, the Visas, and even Amex just released their new own protocol that is much more of a closed loop versus an open loop and has a lot more of the fraud aspects and the compliance aspect all built within. But I think what we'll see is that the components of what have been happening the last couple of years are actually going to help accelerate agentic commerce. And I think tokenization is going to be a big part of that. And it's the PSPs and the issuers and the acquirers who are going to have to adapt to what's happening. For instance, MasterCard has already mandated that by 2030, they want all of the cards to be able to be tokenized. You're not even going to see pans on cards anymore, right? That's another signal that this is a very crucial and fundamental piece of technology that everybody needs to adhere to. And then you still look at account updater and other things, and you'll see, wait, why are still issuers not on account updater? Why are they still taking such a long time? Then let's peel it back a level even deeper. It's all about payments infrastructure, right? The payments infrastructure, the legacy players who are still building their business or still having clients who are on 20, 30, 40-year-old stacks, they're going to be the first ones who are going to have to make the decisions that either we step our game up and be able to go with the times, or you have new players in the market giving issuers on one side the ability to switch from what they have right now to newer modern stacks to be able to go into the mobile commerce, agentic commerce space in doing that. And that's going to allow the networks and the issuers and everybody to continue to drive on all of the innovation that's currently happening. But we're also seeing it on the acquirer sides where we have similar legacy systems now being replaced by newer players in the market as well, who are providing the agility that's necessary to be able to work in that. So I think on a fundamental level, we'll see in the next couple of years payments infrastructure really being replaced and being changed with those who are agile, flexible, modern, cloud native, as well as agentic capable. That will be the first layer. Then you'll see those who are building on top of it, the issuers and the acquirers, utilizing the tools to their capabilities, tokenization, 3DS, all of those other things that are part of the process. And then we'll see that the merchants and everybody else will be able to adapt to it and utilize those services much more. And I think that's sort of like the trajectory that we're on and that we'll continue to see in the next couple of years.
I completely agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the interesting part, though, and again, maybe this is me being the cynical Brit in California, is that it's a huge hype cycle. And so I think while everyone's been actually talking about it, and there is, some really interesting, I think a few things that are actually really happening, where's the real action at the moment? I mean, who are the people that are actually really doing things that we should all be paying attention to? Because the networks, I think, are very busy. The tech companies are very busy as well. The issuers have probably been keeping, their light under a bushel, as it were, to a certain degree as well. Haven't really stepped. We haven't seen that many pilots really coming forwards. There's probably more, I guess, for them to do there. But where are you seeing the actual real action happen, and who are going to be the defining players we should pay the most attention to here?
Well, I think on the issuing side, right, I think those who have already been doing a tremendous job at just really pushing the innovation on the issuing sides. Like I'm looking at companies like Revolut, Nubank, just the ones who are on a modern platform already, who built things from the ground up in this new era where that agility and the ability to launch new products pretty quickly is just evident if you want to win in that race. And I draw that comparison a lot with what I'm seeing in the AI space as well. Remember that time when we would have, well, I wouldn't say annual releases or semi-annual releases with these legacy stacks being able to do that. Now look at AI. every single time I open up Claude or ChatGPT, there's a new update. Hey, you need to relaunch it because they're not waiting for release cycles anymore. You have different teams working on different features all at the same time, releasing that. Now, take that into the financial sectors. If I'm looking who's closest to that new way of developing, continuously developing new things, I'm looking at the likes of a Revolut. I'm looking at the likes of a Nubank. I'm looking at the modern players who are just, like a Ramp and others who are just continuously releasing and just continue to build. So that's what I'm seeing on the issuing side. Doesn't mean that they will win everything, but it's that mindset of continuous releases and continuous development and continuous innovation, but also going across the entire stack. On the acquiring side, I think probably the ones who are best situated are again like the likes of an Adyen, where they've built a modern platform stack, even though it's a company that was built in 2006 and really got to the modern and the full stack back in 2016. They're only 10 years young compared to those who've been around for 30 or 40 years. I think for them, their agility, their ability to leverage machine learning, AI, to build a payments fundamental foundation across the board, from everything from their checkout all the way to finance. It's probably the example that we see. So we see the likes of Stripe and Adyen all building in that similar manner and really taking all of those different elements and really building on that. But then I think there's going to be this new wave of acquirers who have that same mindset. Maybe not necessarily building everything from the ground up, but working with newer providers, similar to how the Revoluts and other ones used modern issuing platforms. You'll see modern acquiring platforms being utilized much more for that agility and that innovation. I'm already seeing it across the board, where I see companies who are on legacy stacks saying, look, we still have a lot of customers. We still have a lot of merchants. We still get a lot of inbound as well. We still get, new merchants coming in, but we need to give them soft paws. We need to give them newer things in a much faster way. And we need a platform that can provide that. We don't have the capabilities internally to go build that, but who is the party that can provide us to that? So I think the winners within that space, both on the issuing side as the acquiring sides, are those with the new mindset of always releasing, always developing, and just being not just ahead of the curve, but as things are changing, being able to be agile and flexible enough to release those new features, even if you know that in 6 months' time or 12 months' time or 18 months' time, that product might not be the hit that you thought it was going to be. But that agility and flexibility is going to be key if you want to succeed in this upcoming years of innovation that we now have.
I completely agree. And I think it's something which we've seen in other technology companies as well. I think that sort of test, pilot, iterate model is critical. And it does remind me, say, the old days when Apple would do one software release a year. You think about that now, and I remember hearing that I think Claude did 72 releases in 50 days. It's just like crazy trying to keep up. I mean, it's like my team all know I love Claude. I think my wife thinks I'm probably got an affair with Claude. Probably fairly true, but it's one of those ones where the speed is terrifying and it's inspiring though at the same time. The challenge is when we think about fraud is that and then we're seeing this now with Mythos is the bad guys have access to these tools as much as the good guys. And all the things we've built this incredible payments industry based on a certain set of human behaviors. We know, how long it's going to take you to click. We know where you're going to dwell. We know that you can identify 7 bicycles on a bunch of cubes. Things like that, where we've spent a lot of time and technology building out this entire ecosystem around fraud. Now, this feels a bit where, to your point, the speed with which this is changing feels like something which could end up being fairly existential for a lot of the payments industry. And that's something which I think, as you say, there is a different mindset required, there are different skills required, there's different ownership models probably required as well. But I mean, what are you seeing around specifically on the fraud side? Because as well as actually the smoothness of being able to transact, we've got to make sure the right people are transacting. And there's still this massive question around liability. So I've thrown in about 5 questions in one there. But I think instead specifically just trying to bring this one back a bit to fraud is what are you seeing in terms of actually how the industry is thinking about adapting to a world where fraud is going to be an entirely new vector of fraud coming out?
Yeah, so I see two two sides, right? Two sides emerging and also two sides adapting to that. So a lot of my conversation now, I'm writing a series called the risk stack, where I'm really diving into all of those different layers within that. And I'm seeing on one side, I'm seeing sort of like the providers who are helping existing issuers and acquirers with managing everything from identity, fraud prevention, all of those different things. And what I'm seeing is that they're also realizing that the behaviors and the insights that you normally would have gotten out of a regular person and transacting, doesn't matter if it's online or at a terminal, those things are actually changing. So you see a lot of them now switching also and understanding what is different now is when an agent shops versus when a human shops. What are the different things, right? Hey, it's based on a VPN, and they have, the speed at which they can process things is different. You don't have device fingerprinting necessarily. You don't have the biometrics. You don't have all of those other elements. So it's learning that new behavior and being able to identify that very early on, but also relying on a lot of the protocols that are out there to be able to understand what are those elements out there. I think that's still at a very early stage, and that's still something that a lot of companies still have to deal with. On the other side, and I think that's probably the most interesting thing to me, is actually that now for the first time, or for something in a long time, is that it's actually the four-party model is actually being expanded now, right? There's two new levels and new layers that come in there. One is what I call sort of like the protocol layer, which is completely free at the moment, right? It's all these new protocols that are coming in that the acquirer will have the ability to implement and then provide that as a service to their customers. But then there's also the AI platforms as well, who are now part of that discovery process and who are also going to capture a lot of that volume. But then the value proposition now becomes all of a sudden for a lot of those acquirers is to how do you deal with authentication? How do you deal with identity? And how do you deal with this new introduction, the know your agent aspect of it? And I see a lot of those payments companies seeing, hey, being able to create that trust layer within that does all of those things for our customer. That's really where a lot of them are now focusing their attention on. I'm doing a lot of conversation. I've done talks at Space for Commerce for MasterCard as well, where I'm introducing that, but I'm also sharing my insights on where I believe that value capture, the agentic economics is actually going to rely on, and that I actually believe that that's the biggest opportunity for acquirers, but also for issuers to be a part of, is that how do you help with that authentication, identity, and know your agent protocols implementation so that you can capture much more of that value. You see the schemes already moving as well and saying, like, tokenization is becoming much more expensive. Other things are going to be much more expensive. So they're capturing that value as well. But that's really the two things that I see, is that fraud prevention, and a lot of those providers are really focusing on the mechanics of all of that and making sure that they can identify all of that. And on the other side, you see a lot more of the acquirers focusing on that trust layer, being able to take those signals as well as all of the other things that they can control, and making sure that those transactions happen in a safe, secure way. Doesn't matter if it's a person or if it's an agent acting on that.
I completely agree. I mean, I think that's one where I think what we see as well actually is, we thought we were really just going to be focused on authenticating transactions. We very quickly realized that actually authenticating identity has to be a critical part of that as well. And without that identity layer, the transaction layer has some real challenges ahead of it. Mark, just turning to you, because you're also obviously dealing with a whole bunch of merchants as well, and you're seeing a bunch of these things in the space. How are they thinking about this trust layer at the moment? What they can do there?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think Dwayne mentioned a couple of things around trust and liability. And I think the frameworks that are being developed by the schemes are, they are evolving. I think the merchants are a little bit nervous. As I mentioned earlier, is that there's so many protocols and so many announcements that were being announced last year. I think there's probably more to come. I think I want to take a step back and think about the consumer. Are the consumers ready to do this? There's expectations that they are. The uptake of OpenAI and ChatGPT is enormous, along with your favorite Claude. But if you think about, payments as quite an emotive element, it's, we were trained for many, many years, consumers, to use your PIN at the point of sale. use your password, your single password. And then contactless came, and that was, oh, do I have to forget about my PIN now? So that's a change. It takes many, many years of consumer adoption and realizing actually I can just buy a round of drinks with my phone, without any sort of authentication other than my fingerprint or my facial recognition on my phone. And we're back to the tokenization. But now we're actually asking consumers to, okay, give all that up, delegate authority to an AI agent to go and do your shopping. There's going to be a long learning curve for consumers to understand actually, is it going to go and buy the right toilet paper roll that I like, or the right shampoo, or the dishwasher tablets when I'm doing grocery shopping, which I've given to an AI agent and delegated that authority? That's going to take a long time of trust. Am I going to trust, Walmart as opposed to Tesco's or Aldi? It's going to be that trust has to be earned, and consumers are going to take a long time to adapt to that. And as I said earlier, it's going to be different from different verticals. Whether it's you're planning a holiday to just buying some groceries.
If I could add on to that, I
Yeah.
mean, trust is key. And I want to circle back to something Dwayne just said. A lot of that trust has been built up over the years through the four-party model, right? The payment networks have created trusted brands, the rules and the protocols everybody agrees with. But as Dwayne points out, now there's more entities getting involved who may or may not be trusted. So how does an industry that has, pick the number of decades you want to choose, worked a certain way, adjust and allow for people to trust these new entities and still feel confident that that is going to be something that they can deal with?
I think it also raises this. I mean, there's a really interesting couple of points there. One, which is obviously about what's going to be the speed of change, the rate of change. And it does remind me a bit. I remember at the beginning of COVID, I was working with a payments customer at the time. And we had what we thought was going to be a really tough project, which was getting people to adopt QR codes. And we were like, this is going to be like at least 9 months to a year. And the US is slow and these things and everything else. 6 weeks into COVID, I'm like, hey guys, we're done. That's it. Everyone knows how to do this now. So I'm not saying we need another pandemic, but I think that would definitely change some things. Yeah, yeah. But I do think there's something interesting here, which you touched on earlier, Dwayne, which is actually around the discovery piece, which is the integration of the discovery, though, with actually that element of payment. As that gets more integrated, and I do hear you about the OpenAI. I think I was convinced that OpenAI was going to be like, they're going to make way more money doing commerce than they would do doing advertising. And it seems that they're going back to advertising, which in many ways I think is a bit of a shame. But when discovery is actually already so ubiquitous, I mean, it's always effectively nearly 1 billion people at OpenAI using it for discovery. Is this a case now where actually by just facilitating, enabling payments to become easier, and actually making it part of the whole shopping process, rather than whereas in the past, I think as an industry, we've often treated it as a separate thing. The payment has always been a separate thing to the e-commerce piece. Now, are those two things, do you think, coming together? Is that going to actually change the speed? And then there's a bit I want to come back to on Jeff as well.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I
Go
think,
ahead, Mark.
yeah, it's interesting. You talked about the pandemic. I mean, there's also like, the Olympics in London, that sort of, pushed contactless through into consumers' consciousness, and they adapted it. I think, yeah, it's debatable where you're going to put that trust. Are you going to give, OpenAI that trust to okay, through the discoverability, and as you said, they've kind of taken a little bit of a step back, and you can understand why. That they don't want to be a merchant of record at the end of the day, because I think where you want to leave it is with the experts. I think Dwayne talked about this. It's the experts or the payment service providers, the likes of Stripe and the likes of Adyen and all the others. They are the ones that are going to end up, doing the payment at the right way, because they've got those years of experience. I think how the consumer interacts with it and delegates that authority to, buy me a ticket, London to Paris, on the Eurostar. I need to go next Tuesday. my budget is $300 or €300, that the trust is going to yet to be proven, whether the system can deliver. Jeff.
So trust, right? Obviously, there's a number of elements of trust. I think, Dwayne, you talked about it. Know your agent, know your customer, verify all those sorts of things. I think the issue for the industry is how do we take the trust we've established over all these years in the way we've traditionally done it and allow it to be extended through these new protocols and these new technologies. And I think that will be a different journey depending upon ultimately who the customer is. I'm old enough to have adult children who have children of their own and things like that. I know my children will definitely be more trusting of something as a digital from a digital brand that they've used before, whether it's Apple or whatever it may be, than I would be because my trust was built up over the years from my bank and my credit card brand and things like that. So I think the adoption rate and how that trust will evolve will be different for different consumers. So the question is, can you really get a set of standards? It won't be a single standard, no matter how you think about it, but can you get at least a manageable set of standards that people can find what works for them to transfer their trust from how they used to do it to this new role? And I think the ones that can figure that out the best and make it the most easily adaptable, because I mean, every entity can't develop this on their own, right? There's going to be some standards that evolve, and they're going to say, I'll get my trust agent from this company, whether it's, Visa, MasterCard, or Google, or whoever. And there's going to only be a few of them eventually because just the difficulty of trying to build your own, the way a lot of typical bank card issuers like to do things, is just not going to work in this environment. So I think you're going to have more than one, and I think you have to find a way to integrate it. And it gets back to the whole, you can't do biannual releases on your platform. You have to figure out how to do this stuff on a real-time basis or as close to real-time as you can do it, or you just won't get the critical mass and this transition to agentic won't happen for you the way it will for others that figure it out better.
I think it's actually where it's sort of taking me is a really interesting piece here because as you were speaking, I was suddenly thinking I use at least 3 different AIs, and I think that's pretty normal. Where you're using ChatGPT, you're using Perplexity, some stuff, you're using Claude and Gemini as well. So there's probably a few more forgotten about. At the same time, if I think about it, I've always had Visa, I've always had MasterCard, I've always got Amex, and at the moment it seems that everyone's going out to try and own the whole system. Now, is UCP going to be the thing that we should all get behind? And the bit that's feeling like it's almost being left behind in this whole conversation is actually how do we keep the human in the loop? Because actually the center of all this is human. I think back to your point earlier, Jeff, which is the person is going to have multiple agents probably running at the same time. I think they'll be instructing those agents, so there will be an element of trust already. It's probably maybe going to be a case of trust getting broken rather than trust being established. And once it's broken, it's broken. But then there's this bit, Dwayne, really for you, which is as we actually look at this, where if the consumer ultimately, the end customer, is going to be the person who's going to decide which schemes are used and how many schemes are used as well. And for them, there's actually the key element for them is going to be trust. What can we all be doing to actually help keep humans in the loop and actually take humans with us? Because it does feel at the moment we've got a bunch of technology companies charging fast to try and provide the ultimate technology solution. But that doesn't feel like it's necessarily going to be the thing that wins.
Yeah, I think, predicting adoption and how that will happen is extremely difficult, right? I think we've seen plenty of new technologies come and we said that's going to be, the end all be all. But we see that it changes. I think what doesn't change for a lot of people, of course, is dealing with risk and dealing with the way that you deal with your money. I think a lot of consumers are always concerned about their money. They don't want to lose out on money or anything like that. So I think the companies that are able to take that risk element, right? Again, we're talking about authentication, identity, know your agent, and are able to wrap that around it. But I also think the biggest thing that we haven't even addressed yet is how do we deal with disputes or liabilities post-transactions? And I think that's actually going to be probably the final piece that we really need to put together. Because just to give an example, it's like currently at the moment, for neither one of the schemes, there is an actual framework that deals with liability post-transactions. What's this chargeback? Did the intent actually, was it registered correctly when I gave it my card and it went to buy some red shoes, but I actually said I wanted purple shoes? Who's to blame within that? Is this a agentic part that needs to be resolved? So I think the networks are not necessarily going to take on that risk, but they do have to define what those rules are going to be and where that is going to be placed. I think then we'll look at the AI platforms. We've already seen that they're moving away from all of that, right? Like sort of like the stack spanning of being able to talk to about tax compliance, the inventory things, the fraud prevention, the merchant onboarding. They've stepped away from that. So I think that then comes back to the payments industry saying, okay, we have to find a way to take all of that risk. I think level number one, what are the protocols? We don't know which protocols it's going to be, but we already know it's going to converge to at least a protocol that we all can get behind, similar to how we did it with the ISO standards back in the 80s, similar how we did that with EMV back in the 90s, similar how we did that with 3DS back in the early 2000s. Now we're just at that pivotal point where we're saying we need a lot of experimentation. Luckily, it's happening at such a rapid time that it's probably not going to take us 5 or 10 years to get that, but probably in the next 6 to 12 months where we're going to see that convergence. So I think that's going to be level number one. What are the protocols going to be in there? Then there's going to be the conversations. There are not a lot of AI platforms out there. Indeed, we're only talking about a Gemini, an OpenAI, a Claude, maybe a Mistral if you're French and you really want them to succeed as well. But those are the ones that we're going to, as an industry, have to talk to as well and say, what is your part? If it's discovery, fine. How do you then make sure that you hand off the transaction properly and that we take on that risk capabilities? And these are the services that we're providing within that. And then we as an industry then need to look at, again, all of those pieces combined. We're taking on that risk. We're doing KYA. We're adding all of these different protocols. And that's how we're going to manage with all of that. And I think once all of that plays out, and I don't believe it's going to take 24 months or 36 months. I believe it's probably going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months where a lot of those things are going to come in place. I think then all of a sudden we'll probably see a rapid adoption in agentic being used, but then probably not in the way that we're expecting it. I think Mark had a great overview of all of those different categories and industries of doing that, where we can say, well, it's probably going to be in retail, but we can't be 100% sure. We think that's the way that it's going to be. I think it's going to be low consumers with a lot of generic and commodity-based goods in there. If I want white socks, doesn't care if it's Nike or Adidas or Hanes or whatever that may be. No, I don't care. As long as they're in my price, they're in my bucket, and they show up, and I'm like, oh, thankful. But if it messes up, is it easily to be reversed, or is it easy to ship it back, or is it easy to get my money back if it's not the right product? I think that's will probably happen much more at a lower point, commoditized products, whereas generic is easier. Hanes beans or just regular beans, it doesn't matter. Like that's probably going to be the point a lot more. But we can also see it on the luxury goods. I actually think that luxury is actually super interesting. You've seen it with sneakers going up, thousands of euros and stuff. I used to work with companies like a StockX and all those other ones, and I saw what bots were doing on that industry, or people were using bots already to make purchases on their behalf. That could also be a great opportunity. So I don't put it across any industry on what that adoption is going to be. I just know that we'll see the different levels, the protocols coming together and converging. We'll see the AI platforms having to have that conversation about, we're just going to focus on discovery ad models, and then we're going to hand it off. And then the payments industry, having to define what those standards and the negotiation of what their pricing and opportunity is going to be. And then we can provide that to merchants who are then going to enable that into their stores, into their Shopify, into their Magentos, whatever they're using. And that's where we'll see a lot of those adoption, and probably much quicker time than we've ever seen before.
No, I agree. I think it's going to be a fascinating time. And you say the timeline is very compressed, and I definitely want to come back to the liability piece, because that's it. That's the big unknown question, I think, on all of this, and it's the bit which is probably going to be the biggest blocker in some ways to this rolling out. But before we get there, you mentioned a really interesting thing, which was actually on luxury, and everything I'm seeing at the moment in agentic is people looking at this, assuming that people only buy based on convenience and price. And in luxury, you're buying something completely different. And there are sure there's the speculators, the StockX, those are the guys who find it is a mass financial transaction. How are we thinking about agents, though, in this world of experience? And maybe, Mark, that's one for you.
We've done quite a lot of work with luxury brands and luxury retailers Interesting. You're more likely to agentic commerce is more likely to, be doing your pet food and the dishwasher tablets than luxury brands. So I slightly disagree with Dwayne on this because the luxury brands are it's more of a sort of sale. It's big ticket items. I doubt an agent would go off and buy a Louis Vuitton handbag. Now, on the other hand, agents that can go and find a limited item or a certain size of item or a limited produced item or collabs. Quite a lot of these luxury brands do collaborations with other designers, and they are limited availability. To be able to, put in an agent to go and make an acquisition, say, my top price is $2,000 or whatever for this particular item at this time, which is going to be released next January, then yes, I think agentic it's definitely got a use case there. But luxury bags and luxury goods, I'm not entirely sure, particularly fashion, because most consumers are still going to want to try it on and get a feel and touch of the item.
Make the final decision, if you will.
Yeah,
It may use an
exactly.
agent to go shop and find it, but
Yeah.
ultimately wants to see it, touch it, feel it, and then buy it. It may
Yeah.
not let it go the last mile to the payment.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think my point on that being said is that the thing that we oftentimes forget is that consumer behavior, right? Like we have a lot of theories about what consumer behavior is, but it's actually continuously changing, right? You see, for instance, like if I look at some of the luxury brands that I've worked with and what I've seen across the space is that luxury is all about scarcity nowadays, right? It's not about something being generically available in doing that. If you can take an Hermes Kelly bag or a Birkin bag, hopefully there's a lot of people who can resonate with that. A lot of people know exactly what they want, how they want it, what that price is going to be. I can easily see a world where an Hermes is the first one to go out and say, hey, this might be something that you can only buy in a store. Okay, so you're not going to get it. But getting the opportunity to buy that bag, it's going to be something that we're going to gatekeep a little bit more. But an agent can actually be the one who can actually apply for it or be the one that we're interacting with until you're available. Because most of those people are extremely busy. They're working, they're making money, they're traveling across the world. They don't want to stand in line. However, you're going to have releases, you're going to have limited editions where, again, people might not want to stay in line or sit behind a browser and refresh it every single time, but they can give their agent very specific instructions. I only want you to go to Hermes.com or whatever the website is. I want to get this particular item. This is the price. If it's a retail price, fantastic. I already know all of those other things in there. But you're going to have to check every 10 minutes, 15 minutes, be able to do that and get me that particular item. And I think it's not so much, it's either Hermes allowing that or luxury brands allowing that. But I think an adoption model could be very easily there. I see it with Jordan shoes. I see it with, all these luxury brands who thrived on scarcity. If you go now in actually any luxury street nowadays, I was in Paris the other week and I was in some of the other ones. Everywhere there's a line around the corner for items that are like people want to get the opportunity to go and buy it. I can easily see a digital world where people are doing the exact same things, where they're paying an agent or they're building an agent or they're utilizing an agent with their card details to just go get me that one item. And I think we're sometimes looking at insane behavior. I'm saying it can be across the board. It can be very low price, generic, commoditized, but I also think the opportunities for luxury brands and whoever's that who wants to sell something that's very specific, limited edition cars, all of those other things, you're going to appeal to maybe a very small audience who can only afford all of that. But the technology is going to be there. And for companies, even in the luxury space, to ignore that wouldn't be great for them. So I think it's not for us to decide where that's going to happen. I do see that it's across the board where it can happen everywhere else. And if that ends up happening, I think that will be great for all of us because it's just proven that it is possible. It just needs specific parameters to actually be able to happen. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, like, I believe that it will be across the board, and we cannot predict it, even though we think a questionnaire or others. I've seen so many of this different reports, but I say at the end of it, we only know what's going to happen. I think the same thing happened with Apple Pay. We thought as yeah, everybody was super excited, but it started out very small. Why? Because we put a limitation on it. You can only pay up to a certain amount, and then it increased, and then issuers had to adopt to it. Nowadays, I think I do my biggest purchase with Apple Pay, right? I can be in a store, I don't even have my card on me, but I can do my biggest purchase with Apple Pay, do my travel with Apple Pay, do a lot of those things with Apple Pay already. And I think that's really the change that we're going to see. I just think that a lot of it can probably happen a lot sooner because we see that people are much more trusting, and when people see that something is working from them, maybe in a small capacity or in something that they really want to have, then they'll try out different things.
It raised lots of really good points there, Dwayne. But I think the interesting part is you're saying that, though. What I'm also sitting here thinking about is it's going to be really tough on the merchants and some of the brands, because actually, how do you know that that agent is the legitimate agent? I mean, every time you're creating demand, all you're actually doing is you're creating demand for fraud at the same time as well. And there is a piece here which is going to be like, actually, as Hermes or whoever else, how do I stop this from being the scammer who's actually going to try and buy the fake bag? I remember years ago, Formula Life, one of the things we always knew is when you released some sort of high value merchandise, you knew at the same time it was 3 weeks later, it would be in the markets in Liverpool, exactly brilliant counterfeit copies. And so every time we've got these moments of high demand, the agent makes it very easy to buy, but actually at the same time, it also makes the fraud easy as well. And the consequence of all that is going to be the liability. And I think that's a bit to really like to sort of just focus on for the last little piece here, which is at the moment, it doesn't seem to be very clear where the liability really sits. I mean, one thing I guarantee is tech companies won't take liability. They don't do liability. They're very good at passing that on. It feels like a pretty massive challenge for the issuers and for the merchants, and obviously for the networks, around where is this liability really going to sit? And also, by the way, also, why do we actually have, in this world of technology and full traceability, why are we also having this liability? Here's an opportunity here to actually eliminate a lot of this fraud. And actually, it will go somewhere else, I'm sure. But I think, Mark, starting with you, just what are you seeing around this whole piece here around the liability question and actually who's going to really own it? Because if we can solve that, then this feels like it can scale. Without that, it feels like we're going to have some real challenges ahead.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you've touched on an interesting point. I think that liability question is still out there and to be answered. From a merchant's point of view, it's as long as they are compliant to all the, it's a bit like PCI. You remember PCI coming in, and they tried to become, PCI agnostic in that, they give the problem to the payment service provider or the gateway, so that they could reduce their PCI liability or responsibility. I think the same is going to happen in agentic commerce. Merchants are of all types of, regardless of whether you're Amazon or a small boutique fashion store, they'll want to be able to give it to somebody who they can trust, and it's going to be their service provider, their payment service provider, whether it's a gateway or an acquirer. That liability needs to be addressed, and I think the schemes are trying to. It's interesting what Amex. I think we touched on that. What Amex has brought out in terms of their liability and protecting the customer and putting the customer first. That's probably the first in the industry that we've seen for a while. They're obviously thinking ahead. I thought Amex, when strong customer authentication came into Europe, I think Amex were way ahead of the game in allowing customers to whitelist certain merchants. And so if I bought my British Airways ticket, I was able to whitelist British Airways as a trusted partner that I buy my airline tickets from. And so whenever I was confronted for the checkout page, I didn't have to go through that rigmarole of getting the single password, etc., because it was whitelisted. I thought Amex took advantage of that. I think that obviously a third party, a three-party model is very different.
Exactly. The closed loop of Amex allows them to do these things because they can apportion out the liability between the issuer and the merchant after the fact. They just want to make sure the customer knows they're covered. A
Exactly.
lot harder to do in the four-party model with all those endpoints. So
Yeah.
they're getting an early lead for sure. It doesn't mean there aren't other things that will come along and sort of neutralize that advantage.
And I think, Mark, you touched on, is this an opportunity to address liability through AI? That's a very good question. I don't think anyone's got an answer yet, but it could be. It could be an opportunity. I think it's also an opportunity to see alternative forms of payment taking hold of doing real-time payments, especially when the agents are transacting with agents. And maybe, cards are not the right mechanism. Maybe it's open banking, faster payments, real-time payments, account-to-account payments are probably more likely to gain traction in that because they'd be more likely to be small transactions. That's my theory. We'll see.
It's a good one.
What do you think, Jeff, on this one as well? Because you've got a huge experience. You've launched credit cards. You've done all the different enhanced value as well as the direct value. Where do you see it going?
Well, I don't know that I have a crystal ball on this one, to be quite honest with you. I think the transition is going to be, people have a certain expectation of where liability is and how they're protected today in the current environment. And they're going to watch to see what happens before they jump in and start to do more of this agentic or new way of shopping. I think it's an interesting mix for consumers because everybody wants to be more efficient, especially younger consumers. They're used to using tools like this and it's just an easy transfer for them, but they're still very, very concerned about the security of their information, their identity, and they're going to want to make sure that if I go down this path, that what I'm used to, which is I never have to pay for fraud, right? It somehow magically disappears off my account and I never have to worry about it again. Is that still going to be the case, or do I have to be a little more aware and a little more, I don't know what the right word is, deliberate in how I choose to use these new tools in order to make sure that I don't inadvertently create something that I ultimately pay for?
No, it's definitely. I mean, I think the predicting future and crystal balls is definitely. If any of us are in that game, we should not be in this room. We should be getting down the stock market as quickly as we can. But we'll come back. We will revisit this in a year's time and see where we will actually got it right and where we got it wrong. Dwayne, I think for you, I mean, you're seeing lots of different angles on it. You're seeing, I think, probably more than this. You're seeing the whole holistic view across the entire industry. What do you see as basically being the key criteria of success, which anyone really in the payment space now who's concerned about fraud, what are the things they should actually be focusing on now in the short term, which is actually going to enable us to actually move this thing forwards rather than just talk about it?
Well, I think what we discussed already is that we're not in an age of being able to sit back and relax and let everything just happen and see how things play out. I think it doesn't matter if it's fraud, doesn't matter if it's agentic commerce, anything within that. I think every single payments company now needs to shift their mindset from being passive and just, oh, we're only focusing on sales and getting new merchants. It's no, now more than ever, the conversations are being shaped. They're being shaped in rooms that if you're not a part of that conversation, you're going to have to adapt to the decisions that others have made on behalf of you. So again, if it's agentic and it's about protocols, you have to be in the room. Doesn't matter how small you think you are, right? Or how big you think you are. You have to be a part of those rooms. You might even have to be in multiple of those rooms to actually understand what's going on within the industry. I think then the second thing that you have to make is make decisions, place multiple bets, and make more experimentations on the way to prevent risk and fraud across the board, right? Is it just on the tokenization aspect? Is it on dynamic CVCs? Is it on 3DS? What are some of those things that you have to have in place to be able to take a lot of that liability off the table as well and really be a part of that? So I think it's about if you're an acquirer, you have to have all of those things in place. You have to experiment. You have to look at data now more than ever. Not just saying, hey, we have data, we have a nice dashboard. Actually see what's the impact for our merchants, what's the impact for our business overall into doing that. And then I also think that you have to be very deliberate as to where you want to operate and where you actually want to grow. I work with a lot of payments companies who have a very global mindset as well. I think now more than ever, if we look at Europe PSD3 or PSR, how you want to call it, as well as all of the other regulations is coming across the board. You have to be very deliberate about what is your plan in that specific regions, because even though the US is very technology focused, Europe is very regulation focused, but what are you doing across the world in all of those other areas? And you need to have a plan for all of that. So it's not just a one size fits all and we can apply everything else. You need to be very focused on the region that you're operating in to actually make an impact. So I think one, be in the right rooms. Two, place more bets than ever. And three, be very focused on which regions you're operating in. And I think take the hardest and the challenging ones. I think Europe is a great place to be in, because if you can solve a lot of those things, right, you can go into other regions like Latin and Asia and the US and actually say, hey, we've solved the hardest of challenges and we're actually here to expand with that in a lighter version, because you don't have to abide by so many rules and regulations. But I actually think that being able to understand that can actually be a moat and actually can help businesses to really thrive within this era where fraud continues to rise, at a large level. But if you're able to come up with solutions that prevents fraud from happening and services merchants, I think then you'll be in a very good place.
I think you teed us up brilliantly, Dwayne, for our next session, which is actually be the thing I'd love to get into next time, is actually thinking about how can we all learn from each other from different parts of the world. Because you say, I think there's some great things happening in Europe. I think some amazing things happening in Latin America. The US, is massive. It's got all the scale. It's also got all the challenges as well. And it's got all the risks of actually making moves. I think there's lots which we can all get into in this multi-geography world of actually what can we learn from each other? Where can we do the tests? How can we actually all together come together to make this whole industry move forwards? But gentlemen, I'd just like to thank all of you very much for a really interesting conversation. I personally really enjoyed that. I hope everyone else listening in also did as well. It was really great, Dwayne. Great to have you on as well. And I think there's some real insights and some real challenges ahead. But it's going to be a fascinating few months coming up. So watch this space. It's all happening far too fast, but it's going to be fun. Hold on for the ride. Thank you all. Take care.